People, what are some of your favorite real, creepy, scary stories? Okay, this is a personal story, probably belongs in No Sleep, but maybe you'll find it scary. I lived in an old farmhouse that was over 150 years old in the 1990s, and at some point had been used as a headquarters for Union troops in Northern Virginia. Lots of creepy crap happened there, but this is the shortest story I've got. The house had a stone cellar divided into 2 rooms, and it always made me uncomfortable going down there to get anything for my parents. One day I was asked to find some menial object that was in the cellar, and I knew it would be in the room with the boiler in it, the room that also had a dysfunctional light. So I made my way into the basement, and lo and behold, the damn light wouldn't turn on, but the object I needed was within the frame of light reaching into the blackness of the room through the doorway. So I walked a few steps into the room, grabbed the object, and randomly glanced around. In the corner of the room was a dark shadow about 6 feet in height and humanoid in shape. No worries though, my dad kept his 6-foot-tall John Wayne cutout in the basement, so that had to be it. I calmly turned to my left and nearly jumped out of my damn skin as I came face to face with John Wayne just inside the doorway and leaning against the wall. So I spun on my heels and stared into an empty corner where the dark shadow had been only moments before, and sprinted my butt out of that cellar. I refused to go down into the basement for at least a month after that happened. This is a personal story, I just posted it yesterday too. So when I was little, about 6 or 7, I was just chilling in my bed one night at about 8 o'clock. My light was on and everyone else was home, mom, sister, dad. I was pretty much wide awake, just sitting in my bed, when I look up at my door across the room to see a large demonic-looking dog/man thing turn around the corner from my kitchen and walk into my room. So naturally, I freaked the F out and throw my bedsheets over my head. I didn't scream or call for anyone, just hid. I peeked out from under the covers and the thing was gone. I stared at it for a solid 5 seconds before retreating under the covers. I didn't mention anything to anybody because I assumed I was seeing things. Fast forward to a couple of years ago when I was 16. It was the middle of August and I was sleeping in the same bed in the same room as before when I was suddenly woken up by somebody punching me in the stomach. Except there was nobody in the room. I could see the entire room thanks to a rather full moon. I was alone. I look at the time and see that it is exactly 3 a.m. So I just lay there a little shaken up and try to go back to sleep. I thought it was probably a dream or something. When I woke up later, I told my mom about what happened. The color from her face just disappeared. The exact same thing had happened to my stepdad at the exact same time on the opposite side of the house. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but that seemed very unlikely. About a month later, my stepdad is lying down on the couch in the basement in front of a fireplace. He has his eyes closed, but he is still very awake. He opens his eyes randomly to see my big butt demon dog friend from 10 years earlier. I hadn't told anyone about that yet. Standing in front of the fireplace. My stepdad blinks and suddenly the creature has moved across the room and is standing next to a candle dedicated to his late brother. He blinks again and it's gone. I still live in the same house, but nothing else has happened other than that. Skeptical old me feels like there's definitely an explanation to this. Maybe you telling them about the creature but not remembering, maybe you forming fake memories, but honestly, I'm not sure, which makes this pretty dang creepy. Grew up on a mountain in Chugach, Alaska. My dad, recently divorced, remarried when I was about 16. My new stepmom had loads of cash and a stepson, so we decided to remodel our 1-story ranch home. It was the middle of summer and I was home alone. My family was out of town visiting relatives in Phoenix and I was sitting in my newly expanded room with the door shut with 2 medium-small dogs in the room with me. Now because we were remodeling, we had the roof kind of half open with a giant butt tarp covering up the exposed areas. So there I am, it was probably 10 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting there at my desk, probably playing CS. Out of effing nowhere, the house starts shaking. Here in Alaska, we got quite a bit of earthquakes, so nothing to worry about. Then the dogs start going effing nuts. Their hair stands up and they were laying there next to the door and they just sprinted over to me with every hair on their body standing up. Then I heard it and I will never effing forget it. The loudest and most feral noise I've ever heard in my life. First, it sounded and felt like a pickup truck just crashed into my living room outside my door. Then I heard this low kind of growling-like noise and my dog literally peed himself on the effing spot. I about did too. I grabbed the nearest object, which I think was an old hockey stick, and put my ear against the door. I didn't hear a thing. I waited probably 5 minutes, panicking, wondering what the F I should do. I figured I would make a break for the phone in the living room and call 911. I was 16 and scared crapless. Give me a break. I slowly opened the door, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I looked up at the exposed second story and didn't see much either, although it was dark. I start slowly walking into the living room, turning on every light switch, even in rooms I wasn't walking in. I'm now slowly making my way to the living room, kitchen area, and then I saw it. The couch was flipped over and the rug was against the wall, rolled up. I got chills just typing this as I am now thinking about how I felt right there, something I try and avoid. I ran right back into my room and shut the door and locked it. I didn't come out until 2 p.m. the next day. The couch and rug were how I left them, and I had to invite some friends over before I felt comfortable even touching the furniture that was moved. I didn't tell them what happened. I honestly don't like telling this story. It's kind of one of those weird things you just want to black out. What made me think of it recently was watching Paranormal Activity 1. The scene where they hear the loud bang and they go into the living room and the chandelier was swinging brought me back to that memory when I was home alone. The same frightening bang. I never had any weird experiences after that, just an occasionally, probably paranoid feeling like I was being watched. A lot of people make up crap all the time for attention and whatnot, but after my experience, I truly believe that some of those effed up stories are real and that I may have experienced one. Damn, stories like these really kind of get me. Like, it feels kind of weird and almost pointless. Why the couch flipped and carpet moved? It is so bizarre that it makes it feel all the more real to me. I'm still skeptical, but stories like these keep me from being 100% a skeptic. I can't back this up with any evidence, so I have no idea why I'm even telling this. I just need to get it off my chest. I live in Singapore, and over here we don't really have the same ghosts as Westerners do. We have our own version of a vampire called a Pontianak, which originated from Indonesia, which is the ghost of a vengeful woman who died in childbirth. Wikipedia says it's folklore, but to some of us who've seen her, she is all too real. For those who want a description, just imagine that ghost from The Ring, dressed in white, long hair covering her face, etc. For years, I've been fearful of encountering this ghost. I've always tried to avoid certain places which have been rumored to be her dwelling grounds, but sometimes it's inevitable. One of those times, I did see her along with a few of my friends, and I never forgot what happened. So my friends and I decided to go cycling one night. I only just learned how to cycle, so I was pretty slow compared to the rest. I also preferred cycling at night at secluded, open places because I was embarrassed by the fact that I didn't really know how to cycle. So we went to our usual spot at a park, and it was empty save a couple making out on a bench and us. There was a playground in the distance, so we decided to head there and take a smoke break. As we got closer, we started to notice that there was someone sitting on the swings. Not swinging, just sitting there, facing the floor, hands by the sides, hair almost touching the ground. She was dressed in all white, and instantly we all knew. "Ms. P," my friend shouted to us. I could feel my blood getting cold, my hairs standing in goosebumps all over. It was as though my blood magically vanished from my body. I froze while my friends, ballsy or idiotic if you're looking at it logically, as they were started to approach her. They taunted her, hurling insults and laughing like maniacs. As they circled her from a distance, I saw her starting to twitch. Mind you, I was quite a distance away from my friends. Suddenly, she bolted upwards and started cackling like a mad witch. I think the proper word for use for her movement is glide. Yes, she glided across the playground. Worse still, it was towards my direction. Rumor has it that these ghosts target the weak link, those who are easily frightened. In that case, it was me. My friends were reasonably shocked, and they darted off in different directions on their bikes. I was stunned as I saw my friend zooming past me. "Hoth, let's get the F out of here," my friend shouted to me as he cycled past me. I got on my bike and started pedaling like crazy. This was the fastest I've been on a bike. I could feel the wind rushing through my hair. I don't know if it was an unfortunate circumstance or if it was the work of some evil voodoo, but my right pedal suddenly broke, bringing my slipper along with it. I stumbled for a few seconds, turning back to see the pursuer. I might be remembering wrongly, but I swear she was almost an arm's reach away. I didn't care about anything after that and cycled away with one bare foot on a thing called metal bar instead of a proper pedal. I didn't stop cycling until I couldn't hear that wicked laugh of the creature. Needless to say, I never went back to that park again, even in the day. True story, honor system. I work in a warehouse that my father purchased. He bought it for 25% of its cost from a farmer who seemed very excited to be rid of it. It's in the middle of Mennonite country with no neighbors for a half-mile around. Look out the window, you see cornfields and scraggly trees. Cell service? Forget about it. I work here alone, painting and prepping the front office portion for eventual functionality. To get to the front office, you must go through a hallway from the main warehouse and into a secondary office and then through another door into the front. I frequently hear bumps and thuds and occasionally will go into the warehouse and feel air movement, but I've always attributed it to drafts and animal life in the roof. The only thing that has ever made me uneasy about the building is the fact that all of the door locks are reversed. Whoever installed those locks didn't intend to keep people out, they intended to keep something in. I was in the front office when I began to hear the thudding. I ignored it and continued to apply masking tape to the door I was working on. But this time, it was accompanied by a screeching sound. Not loud, but audible. I was freaked out, but convinced myself that it was just a peed-off raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside. I continued working until I heard the slam. The door to the secondary office had been open. It sounded like it had violently slammed shut. I peeked around the corner and saw that I was right. The secondary door was now closed. I tried to logic it through in my head that a strong draft had sucked it closed, although I knew there was no such draft. The thudding began again, closer this time. I've never been able to put a proximity on it, but now it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I froze, unsure of what was happening. My eyes locked on the door handle, which began to turn. The door disengaged its latch and slowly swung open, wider, nothing there. Nothing visible, no air movement, just quiet. So quiet. A quiet that seemed to overwhelm me with its presence, a quiet so thick I couldn't breathe. The quiet was shattered when the screech came again. This time it was clearly human. Pained, angered, and emanating from the main warehouse, the door slammed. That entirely broke my frozen, fearful state. I ran. I got into my car and drove until it was in cell range to call my father. He didn't believe anything about the door closing, but agreed that the building had something weird about it. He told me he'd be right out. Fast forward half an hour, my dad and I met up and drove back to the warehouse. I showed him the door that slammed, showing him that it was separated from both the front office and the main warehouse, so no draft could have closed it. I told him about the thuds, the screeching, and the sudden quiet that overcame the building. He decided that we should check the main warehouse. Emboldened by his presence, I led the way. Something you should know about this warehouse, it was formerly a furniture manufacturing place owned by a Mennonite farmer. They made handmade chairs, tables, etc. Because of all the cutting that went on, the floor is thickly coated with dust. We walked into the warehouse and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The dust was untouched, the doors were closed. Windows were locked. The only thing out of the ordinary was one of the hanging fluorescent light fixtures. It was hanging askew and swaying slightly. Insisting we take a look at the mount to ensure it didn't just break loose, my dad grabbed a stepladder. He supported it while I climbed up and grabbed the swinging light. I looked on top of the light and saw a handprint, a single, fresh, and humanly large handprint. No footprints in the dust around the light, no signs of a presence. I climbed down and switched places with my father. He saw it and said, "What the hell? There's been no one in here for years." He climbed down and told me he'd been suspicious of someone breaking in and stealing parts from the warehouse light system. He couldn't believe me that this wasn't human, that something wasn't right here. The last thing he said was, "Nothing is here, next time just go back to work." And then, as if to show its presence, the thud returned. This time it wasn't just a thud, but more of an earthquake. The entire building felt like it moved. The heartbeat-like thud was then overlaid by the screech, the awful, awful screech. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. We ran, and I haven't returned. My father hired someone to finish the job and has since moved into the office. He's heard the thudding, but thus far nothing has happened further. What actually happened? I don't know. Nor do I ever care to know. What I do know is that there is something paranormal in that building, and the man who sold it to us knew. I'll never forget the sound of that lock turning by itself or the feeling of the deafening silence. Well, whatever is in there certainly knows how to put on a good show. Frankly, I feel like you should go back and investigate further, talk to the Mennonite, record some stuff, ghost hunt that place. Wouldn't you like a little closure? My best friend's mother growing up told me a story that I've never ever been able to forget. They have a good amount of mental illness in their family, and when she was a little girl, she had to go visit her grandmother at the asylum pretty often. On one of these visits, while walking down the hall to her grandmother's room, she heard a strange noise come out of one of the rooms. When she turned to look, she saw a woman sitting on her bed. The woman had pulled her eyes out of their sockets, and they were just hanging there. She screamed and was rushed away and never went back. Flat out refused, said she had nightmares for years. Me too, Tammy. Me too. About a year ago, I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep with my wife, asleep, cuddled up to me on my left side like she always does. I reached that point where I could feel my conscious mind begin to fade, that point where unless you jar yourself out of it, you won't remember it, but if you do, then you'll remember it. All at once, I feel a slight chill on my right side, and I hear some sort of weird, slow whispering that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded like someone whispering something backwards slowly. I was immediately awake and my eyes darted around the very poorly lit room, but I saw and felt nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I'm getting my coffee and my wife mentions a very strange dream that she had last night right after she fell asleep. I asked what she dreamed and she told me, "I dreamed I was lying in bed next to you in our apartment just like normal, except I was awake. I felt a strange presence, so I looked up and standing at the foot of the bed was my friend Adam, not real name. He looked at both of us, then crawled up onto the bed and started whispering in your right ear. I thought it was a really weird dream. Oh yeah, my friend Adam killed himself about 6 months prior to this." So, my story has nothing to do with groups of people or anything like that, but it lingers in the back of my mind to this day. This is set up in the month before we moved out. About 10 years ago, when I was around the age of 9, we lived in our previous house and were starting the process of moving out. Now, I had grown up in this house and all my friends lived around me, so I was very torn about moving out. There happened to be a very bad thunderstorm that one of the nights before we were finished moving, and all my toys were in boxes. Some of the toys started making noises as if I was playing with them. Now, my mother told me that it was the electricity in the air from the storm. Today, I feel like she was telling that to herself too. I didn't think much of it though because I was 9. As we were getting ready to leave, my sister had always had imaginary friends, and for a girl who was 5, that seemed pretty normal, I suppose. The problems were that she would go to bed earlier than me, and when I would stay up late to watch Adult Swim, I would always feel like someone was looking at me from the hallway where her room was. This had always been going on, but it only grew as we prepared to leave. This is the part that literally has my hair standing up telling it. The last day has come and we were putting the final boxes in our truck when I decided to go in and look around, make sure I had everything. When I was in the basement, where I played N64 and basically lived, I felt a very sad feeling coming over me, like I was leaving my life behind to move somewhere really far away. I kind of became emotional so quickly I rubbed my eyes for I didn't want anyone to see me, a young man, crying. I then, for whatever reason, said goodbye to the house as if it was living. The very moment I said goodbye, I heard a very childlike voice reply, "See you later." I stood frozen. When I turned, a red ball was lying on the floor that I did not remember being there. I sprinted out of that house and got in the car. My mom asked me what was going on. I replied, "There's a ball inside in the basement. Leave it there." Years later, everyone in my family had told me they saw the same red ball after they felt the need to say goodbye. Only me and my sister heard the reply. My mom and dad only saw the ball. I don't really believe in ghosts, but whatever that was, I'm effing scared crapless of that house now. I mean, to be fair, combine a child's imagination and the stress of moving, this doesn't feel too hard to explain for me. Not saying it couldn't be something more, but I remember floating in the kitchen as a child. I feel confident in saying that no matter how vividly I remember it, it did not happen. Let me preface this by saying that I come from a somewhat rural part of Michigan, about an hour and a half north of Detroit, where M is very popular. My friends and I were driving from Rochester to a house party about 4 miles out of Oxford. We like sticking to the back road, so instead of making the sensible decision and going on a paved road, we went down Dronner Road. We were driving my friend's Wrangler and going as fast as we possibly could when we suddenly had to come to a sudden screeching stop. In the road about 50 feet ahead of the car, about 25 listless people stood empty-eyed and expressionless in the middle of the road. My friend put it into first and started slowly approaching the people who did absolutely nothing to avoid the car heading towards them. As we got closer, they moved only enough to assimilate the Jeep like when a one-celled organism eats another. They stood only inches from the car and stared in listlessly with blank expressions as we slowly trolled through their human barrier. Once we had passed the last of them, my friend floored it and inadvertently shot rocks into the crowd. This greatly agitated them. They started ranting nonsense and gave slow, steady chase, but we quickly lost them as my friend drove the car as fast as he could. We only got a mile when my friend rounded a tight corner and hit an enormous pothole. The right front tire suffered from severe decompression and flattened. We immediately jumped out of the car and started the quickest tire change outside of an F1 race. We started hearing their shouts, and the job became the fastest tire change ever. As we pulled the jack out from under the Jeep, the first of the M-heads started rounding the corner. We all jumped in the car and never looked back. Gonna go ahead and say a small army of M'd out zombies is far and away the scariest thing we've read thus far, because I can believe it, and it sounds terrifying. Most terrifying thing to happen to me was when I was about 19 years old. I was driving home from my then boyfriend's place at about 2 a.m. In my town, we have what we call the Loop, basically a freeway that makes a big circle around the city. As I'm driving, the Loop is deserted, very common late night on weekdays. Well, I come up on this old beat-up brown truck with a camper on the back going about 45 to 50 miles per hour, 15 miles under the speed limit, so I decided to pass him. Next thing I know, I look at my rearview mirror and see this truck right on my bumper, forcing me to go faster and faster. I'm in a panic by this point, and as I'm watching him, I notice he has some cheap butt blue and red flashing light on his dashboard. Obviously trying to trick me into thinking he is a cop, I was thankfully smarter than that. I decided not to take my exit to my house so he can't see where I live. In my panic state, I decided to call my older brother and parents to hopefully wake up and be waiting for me to pull up in case he followed me home, instead of calling the cops. I live in Texas, so naturally my parents owned guns. My logic was dad in the yard with a shotgun. After no luck reaching my family, I just did my best to outrun him. Thankfully, we came up on some cars on the Loop, which gave me a perfect opportunity to pass them as quick as I could and take the next exit. I thought I finally lost him and took the turn around back towards the direction I needed to go to get home when I see him coming up behind me again. I continued to drive up the access road and watched him get back on the Loop, then exit on the access road again. He followed me all the way to the light, but instead of going right, he went left. I just sat and stared at the truck for a few seconds before turning and hauling butt down the road toward my street. I decided it was best to weave through the neighborhood by my house to make 100% sure he wasn't following me home. I immediately ran to wake up my parents to call the cops, who were no help until I told them he was trying to act like a cop and pull me over. I always thought something like that would never happen to me, and if it did, I would be smart about it and actually call the cops first thing, but when it's happening, you lose your head a bit. Luckily, I was level-headed enough not to break down crying and do what I could to outrun him. My grandma told me this story a couple times. Her old house, like some other people mentioned, wasn't in the kind of neighborhood where people left their front doors unlocked. The house was a split level, which is like 3 steps to the next level. So she was on the second floor taking a nap on the other side of the house from the back door. She woke up to the dog, a well-trained German shepherd, whining and barking next to her. She got up, felt a cold draft through the house, and went to the back of the house and noticed that the attic stairs had been pulled down from the ceiling. She then noticed that the back door was open. It had been raining outside and there were no footprints from the attic to the back door, so my grandma figured someone must have been up in the attic, pushed the stairs down, and left. The thing that creeps me out the most is just the thought of some stranger being in the house without you knowing or seeing. In high school, I worked with the choral and theater departments on the spring musical every year. There was a girl who had graduated a few years before me that everyone knew, and a close friend of mine, who was 2 years older, had known and spoken with about this story. The girl who this story is about is named Rebecca, and how she could see angels and demons. Since she was young, she would always notice these certain kind of people walking around wearing all khaki clothing, buttoned-up trench coats, slacks, long dresses, etc. She said they always had a sort of bland pallor to them. When she was younger, she assumed everyone could see these people. But then, she started noticing that they would follow people around, but the people they followed would never seem to notice. Every once in a while, she would also see another type of person, this time dressed in all white, floating around unnoticed behind other people on the street. Then she said that they seemed to realize she could see them. They would show up everywhere she went and oftentimes follow her. Every time they entered a room she was in, she heard a faint pop noise. Eventually, she told her parents, and they were understandably hesitant about whether or not to believe her. But then some specific instances occurred where paranormal-type things couldn't really be explained away. I would write them out, but when my friend told me this story, it took a good hour or so, and it's been years since I heard it firsthand. So her parents looked to their priest at their church for help, and after a while they came to pray over their house and help protect it from the demons coming inside. The prayers apparently worked because the girl told my friend how there seemed to be an invisible fence around the house that kept them from coming near, but you could still see them occasionally stalking around the house in circles, waiting. I still get shivers thinking about it. While this sounds like an interesting story, without any of that evidence you skipped, it mostly feels like a girl who's maybe suffering from a mental ailment or perhaps is just seeking attention. Even a synopsis of that hard-to-explain-away evidence would be much appreciated. This is not a personal story, but something that happened to my best friend Kelsey. She and the girl she was with both have told me this story several times, and at the very least I believe they believe it. Apparently one night they were driving around a neighborhood late at night. Since it was a residential street, their car was pretty close to the sidewalk and they were going pretty slow. At some point they noticed someone on the sidewalk just ahead of them. From what they could see, it was around 5'10", maybe 6 foot, and wearing a black cloak and hooded jacket. It wasn't all that unusual, except it didn't move like a normal person. It didn't really shift side to side or move up and down like it was walking. It just glided along in a perfectly straight line. Pretty soon after first seeing the thing, they were right next to it. Kelsey, who was driving, looked down at the thing's feet, and it didn't have any. In fact, it didn't seem to touch the ground at all. At this point, the figure suddenly turned its head and looked right at Kelsey, who promptly floored it and never looked back. Obviously, Kelsey and her friend only got the briefest of glances at the thing's face, but they both said it didn't have one, that all they could see under the hood was black. Depending on how long ago this was, it kinda sounds like they saw someone playing a prank with some kind of drone or something. But who knows, I would certainly have freaked out too. My dad told me this story from back in his Navy days. He was on the night watch during a particularly calm night. It was cloudy, so there was no moon, no stars, so this was in the middle of the 1970s. I think he said around Alaska, but I'm not sure. Wherever they were, it was somewhere where the ship needed to have its lights off to avoid detection. Well, he's standing there in the dark when he starts to hear this high-pitched whining sound from somewhere behind him. Just as he turns around, there's this incredibly loud bang and a bright flash. He said it felt like he'd just been flashbanged. The silhouette of the ship's mast burned into his retinas, and he said it was all he could see for the next few minutes. And it looked like a giant grasshopper, which I guess would be pretty creepy. Turns out that a Russian jet had done a low flyby on them and taken a picture of their ship. Apparently the entire ship noped out after that, and they sailed off in the other direction. So this is my aunt's story about her old house. I honestly don't believe in ghosts, but when she told me all of the things going on at the house, I made an exception. She inherited the house from her grandma about 5 years ago. Nothing major happened, just lived there in peace. Then her dad died. Her dad and grandma didn't get along very well. Weird crap started happening in her house. In the kitchen, the chairs would be moved away from the table when they were pushed in the night before. Doors would be opened that were shut the night before. Strange, but nothing major. But then other relatives who went into the house corroborated with these stories, and even more serious incidents started happening. Her daughter would not be able to sleep. She said she would hear and see things. Her daughter's babysitter, a family friend, spent the night. When she woke up, she said she felt a person holding her down as she had to struggle to get them to get up. At this point, pretty much everybody in my family was freaking out. Things continued to get worse. One day she was in the house and she heard a phone ringing, but it wasn't coming from upstairs. The ringing was coming from downstairs in the basement where my aunt's dad lived, the one who didn't get along with the grandma. The basement had been locked shut for 2 years at this point. The phone bill hadn't been paid for the same amount of time. My aunt opened the door, walked downstairs, and still heard the ringing getting progressively louder as she descended the stairs. When she got to where the phone was located, there was no phone, just an empty cable with the sound of ringing still permeating the air. They moved out shortly thereafter. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.